In this next lecture, we're going to take a look at the arguments for and against moral relativism or ethical relativity. We've got a little bit into some of these issues as we've come to define ethical relativism. In the last slide, we were looking at the term meta-ethical relativism, and this is the claim that moral judgments are not true or false in any absolute sense, but only relative to particular standpoints. And what I was starting to explore there at the end of the last lecture is sort of this spectrum where moral absolutes, rules that are binding across cultures and traditions and time periods, are on one end, and the claim of moral relativity being that everything is conditioned in all circumstances is on the other end. And it may be that the role of ethics and dialogue and diversity and discussion is somewhere in between. And that we need not say, because we don't have moral absolutes, therefore moral relativity is true. And so that's what we're going to explore a little bit more in terms of the arguments for and against. So there are four reasons given in the article, section 3, for ethical relativism or moral relativism. One is the argument from cultural diversity, again reminding us that descriptive diversity is not the same thing as ethical relativism. So we'll talk about that shift. The second reason is the untenability of moral objectivism, the fact that we don't have moral absolutes. The third is an argument from cognitive relativism. What is it that we can know? And the last is sort of connecting this idea of relativism and tolerance, which we're going to explore a bit more. So let's look again at the idea of descriptive or cultural diversity. So again, the fact of diversity does not logically entail that moral relativism is true. And your author gives the analogy of, while there are maybe diverse theories on how human beings came to exist, this does not entail that there is not one theory eventually that will turn out to be true. But I want to start to raise this idea of moral truths. And are moral truths the type of truths that are exclusive and binary? In other words, there is only one right answer. Could it be that there are more than one moral conclusion to a particular problem? It might be different than some of the natural sciences in that way. So we'll come back to that. The claim of untenability of moral objectivism. It is historically true that many of our Western moral systems were based on claims of objectivity and absolutes in truth. We talked a little bit about Christendom and religious moral theories, although not all religions have this. I talk about this particularly in comparative religions with Confucian and Buddhist thought. There is no universal divine lawgiver, but for a lot of the monotheistic traditions, there was the claim that we should do and not do certain things because God, as the absolute divine lawgiver, has laid out these commands. As we move into the modern period in the Enlightenment project, we start to see that instead of appeals to God or religious authority, that reason and logic are going to be the groundwork, the objective basis on which moral conclusions can be drawn. And in our next unit, we're going to see that particularly with Immanuel Kant and in utilitarianism and some of those other Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers. Some claim that we're now in a period called postmodernity. This is sort of a philosophical and cultural designation that basically says that we live without universal grounds for these types of truth claims. That while in the past we had some sort of assurance in our minds that there was something holding it all together, but in fact we live with a lot of plurality and a lot of relativism. The argument from cognitive relativism is again saying, how can we come to know an absolute? And what does it mean to say that moral norms are relative to particular cultures? this was sort of an interesting section where we started to explore if we're saying that people's moral norms are influenced from their culture and upbringing. Well, that seems to make sense. That doesn't necessarily contradict that there might be a moral truth out there. If they are determined by culture or upbringing, that doesn't seem to be the case, because individuals do change their views and their moral stances over a lifetime. So what is it that's really being claimed about what we can come to know? Maybe the claim is that there's no privileged viewpoint. There's no God's eye point of view that yields objective truth, particularly in morality. But this introduces one of the logical paradoxes of relativism. If we're saying that all moral truths are relative in all places, in all times, for all people, that just created an absolute claim to truth. And if there are no absolutes, then relativism is not true. So the most you might be able to say is that relativism seems to be true as best as we can or you can understand it in a conditioned statement. And I would argue that as long as we have the possibility of a absolute or a larger truth, even if we can't assert it, relativism is not true. So there is a bit of a paradox, an inconsistency, really, in the claim of the relativist. Just one more argument for relativity. Ethical relativity might mean that one is less likely to fall into arrogant ethnocentrism. In other words, asserting your own culture, your own religion, your own views as superior to all others. And there's a particular author that's cited, Ruth Benedict, who's an anthropologist, who says that relativity can be positively beneficial in helping to combat bigotry, racism, chauvinism, and other forms of prejudice. And so we're going to return to this ideal of tolerance in the next lecture. But if the ultimate goal of ethical relativity is this idea of tolerance, isn't that itself a moral norm? Isn't that itself a moral claim that you're trying to apply across the board? So let's take a look at some more objections to moral relativism. One of the claims that's discussed is that relativists exaggerate cultural diversity. And I have a listing here on the right of what is often called the golden rule that you see in many different religious traditions. Another posit is that relativity actually ignores diversity within a culture. Moral relativism might also imply that obvious moral wrongs are somehow acceptable. So we want to kind of see how that would apply to assessing particular figures. And then once again, we're just going to take a look at the idea of the notion of tolerance with a relativist viewpoint. So even though we recognize that there are different beliefs and different moral claims across culture and across time, we can see through comparative studies that there are agreed upon values across religions. There are notions of compassion and justice, care for the suffering, that we see across a wide variety of religious and ethical theories and traditions. It was also interesting to note some of the neuroscience that's happening, particularly at Harvard in a lab where they did a wide variety of surveys of people across the globe, and some of their results are showing some universally shared moral faculty. So while we do recognize that there are differences, there might be some shared upon norms that we could explore more. The other claim is that relativity ignores the diversity within a culture. So even within, let's just say, American culture, we certainly have differences of opinion when it comes to abortion, euthanasia, women's rights, gay rights, etc. And there might even be overlap and influence across cultures. So again, this idea that all claims are relative to particular cultures and communities, as soon as we start to point out diversity within or influence across, that's starting to break down those barriers. So in this sense, diversity should not mean segregated and isolated communities and cultures. But if dialogue and exchange can happen, then that's starting to move us beyond the claim of the relativists that we're sort of isolated in those truth claims. One of the other implications that gets explored is that if all moral claims are relative to a particular culture and context, we're going to need to conclude that slave owners and Nazis were equally morally right and praiseworthy within their context as figures like Martin Luther King or Gandhi or other sort of benevolent, ethical, moral heroes in different senses. And this sort of gets into just sort of the practical import of that. Would we want to live in a world that would grant equal power and support of dictators or fascists or people who kill innocent people as we would those who might be morally benevolent and kind? So again, we wind up needing to conclude from a relativist position that the Nazis were equally good as some counterexample, and that just seems intuitively wrong. The position on tolerance, we're going to explore more, but it's not the same as respect, as she talks on page 24. And if we want respect for other cultures and other people, that might mean taking others' views and moral claims seriously. This might involve dialogue and even critical scrutiny. And even with that, we might tend to disagree, but still have respect for the moral conclusions of another. So we want to talk a little bit more about this balance of sort of engaging in truth claims, taking those claims seriously across individuals, across culture, even across time, but still sort of providing respect. Also, if tolerance is part of the universal obligation that comes from ethical relativism, we're again in that sort of that logical paradox we saw earlier. If the ultimate goal of ethical relativity is to assert a moral norm across cultures and across times, then they're sort of defeating their own claim that everything is conditioned. And I just want to draw us to this conclusion that ethics is looking at the reasons and arguments around moral claims. And when we get into this idea of judging other people or being tolerant of other people, oftentimes we feel like if we morally disagree with a decision, that makes that person who made that decision or performed that action as morally wrong or morally deficient. And that's a separate question in ethics. Ethics doesn't necessarily answer questions about responsibility or what's sometimes called culpability. There is a way that we can kind of talk about the moral status of a person or people, but for the most part, ethics is trying to look at reasons around decisions. And so we're going to separate sort of an analysis of a decision or an action from a moral judgment of a person. The next lecture is going to explore those notions of tolerance. I want to look at a particular theory by Karl Popper, as well as the idea of self-critical analysis. And if we can do this for our own thinking, how do we apply that in a wider sense as well? So we'll take a look at that next.